Dodge this.
One world currency.
The New World Order.
Those are the roots of trouble.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from FederalJack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another live edition of DTRH. It is November 5th, 2015. It's that time of the year again, ladies and gentlemen. You all know what time of the year it is. It's that time of year where I do multiple shows about the Kennedy assassination. You all know that's one of my pet peeves. That's one of my specialties. Now, I know I cover a lot of different things, but this time of year I have a tendency to get into this. And I'm going to be actually doing multiple shows on this throughout the month. But today I'm starting off the Kennedy Assassination 2015 broadcasts with a very good friend of mine. I've actually had the pleasure of being on his podcast, but I've never, ever, ever had him on DTRH before. Of course, that's about to change, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to waste any more time because I want to bring him right up because I'm going to have him introduce himself, tell you a little bit about himself, and I'm going to make him shamelessly plug everything he wants to plug, including his Twitter or Facebook, YouTube channels, Spreaker, whatever he wants to plug for his podcast and stuff, anything he wants to throw out there. If he wants to give somebody some love, I know he wants to give a shout out to a few people, so I'm going to have him do all that stuff first, and then I'm going to have him introduce himself to you all, and then we are going to get into the JFK assassination. So let me welcome to the broadcast, ladies and gentlemen, to the airwaves, but not to my ears, because my good friend and I have had multiple conversations, multiple hours, probably tens of, I would say close to hundreds of hours of conversation about JFK. Anyway, my good friend, ladies and gentlemen, Doug Campbell. Doug, welcome to DTRH for the first, but most certainly, my brother, not the last time.
Thank you very much, man. That is you are too kind, too kind in your intro. That was very nice, and it's good to hear your voice again, brother. It is, I promise.
So, take a few minutes and introduce yourself to the listening audience. Tell them about who you are and your podcast and what got you. Let's start off with what got you into doing this and what got you interested in this. But first, before you do that, go give out your shameless plugs, because I know we're going to forget. So go ahead.
My shameless plugs. I'm on the Spreaker network, Spreaker.com, podcasting network with my little show. It's called The Dallas Action. I started the podcast out about the same time, I guess May of last year, with my good friend Rob Clark, who hosts the Lone Gunman podcast. We kind of started together. My son Hunter, my oldest son, who I met you through Hunter. Actually, if you remember, he got to listen into your show and turn me on to your show. And he downloaded this free Spreaker app, podcasting app, and did a blues show. He's a guitar player like me, and he just played some of his old favorite blues tunes. And one day he went, "Daddy, you should do a JFK podcast." And I went, "Well, that's an idea." And then you and I had met by that point, and I said, "I'm thinking about doing this," and you said, "Go for it." And I contacted Rob. And we were trying to figure a way to do a show together, but we couldn't, just because at the time the technology was kind of over our heads. So he started the Lone Gunman, and I started the Dallas Action, and it's grown over the past 18 months. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of fun. I can be found on Spreaker.com. That's SPREAKER.com. You can find my show there. Stitcher.com, which is a podcasting network. And recently, I was picked up. The show was picked up by two other small independent podcasting networks. And I want to give a shout out to those guys, Mark Bogner over at the Tangent Bound Podcasting Network, and Devin at the Wicked Radio Podcasting Network. They picked the show up, but the easiest way to find all the links to my shows is the website that you, sir, inspired us to start, Rob and I, which is 22novembernetwork.wordpress.com. I'll repeat that. It's just 22novembernetwork, one word, .wordpress.com, and you can find all the links to all my archives, all my shows, all my posts, and everything right there. And I think we got the plugs out of the way, brother.
It's kind of cool because I've gotten a chance to see your I don't want to say awakening, your growth as a host, as a broadcaster, for real. Because I remember when you weren't doing this, and I remember meeting you. And big shout out to Hunter, my buddy. Your kid, Doug,
yeah.
is the smartest kids I've ever met. That kid he's ahead of his time. He really is. So big shout out to him. I know that'll blow his mind that I just gave him a shout out on live radio. So there you go, Hunter. That's for you, buddy. And you got more.
I happen to know the other part of the house listening. I happen to know that for a fact.
Well, he's got other Federal Jack T-shirts coming too. I have a couple extras I'm going to throw his way.
Thank you. I told him that too the other day as well. I told him there was some more on the way, because he's a big guy for his age. He's 15, but he's about 6'3", 240. So yeah, I'm wearing the one.
I love that kid. He's got the balls to wear my T-shirts to his school. Okay, he gets as many free T-shirts as I can give him. That's how that's going to work.
Oh, well, he loves us down the rabbit hole, man. It was your Titanic and Jack the Ripper stuff that he first latched onto, and then turned me onto your show. And I think if I remember right, he sent you a message or one day asking you about some details on one of your Titanic shows, and you actually answered him, and that blew his mind. And yeah, he's been a fan of Down the Rabbit Hole since longer than me, actually. So yeah, we got to give him a big thank you for that.
Yeah, he did actually introduce us, so thank you, Hunter. See, now your old man's on my radio show. Is your mind blown yet, kid? That's the sound of Hunter's brain exploding. So, Dougie.
Yeah, it's the whole show about him if we're not careful.
True that. Let's get into what got you into the assassination. Before we get into the minutia, because you and I can do this for hours. Tell the listeners what What got you? Yeah, we have. What got you the average? The average guy. Blue collar, average, everyday man, just like everybody out there listening, right? Everybody. We're all the same. And here, Doug, I know that Hunter was helpful in getting you into it, but what made you look into the assassination itself?
I can remember being 5 years old. I have a distinct memory of it. When Robert Groden and Dick Gregory brought forth the Zapruder film for the first time to the public on Geraldo's show. And, of course, that show was on too late for me to watch, but, of course, the next day it was all over the news. And I have, like I said, a very distinct memory of seeing the Zapruder film the next day, the next evening on television, and watching it with my father. And him saying, "Oh, that's wrong. There's something's up. It's the whole back into the left thing." And that was at 5 years old, and that struck a chord with me. And so it lay dormant until age 11. And I was, and I've actually heard you on one of your past shows talk about the fact that your mother took you to the public library on a weekly basis, on a regular basis, correct?
Yep. I had a library card that I had no tread left on it by the time I was done with it when I was a kid. She made me read.
Me too. And from the time I was old enough to have one, my mother would take me every week. And it was about age 11, it was age 11 where I was making my way from the children's section of the library, you're kind of making your way to the adult section, and I saw the book Best Evidence by David Lifton. And that's a pretty big book, full of minutia and medical terms and this and that for an 11-year-old to absorb. And I remember I checked this book out 4 months in a row and reread it and kept reading until I was able to absorb it. And from then on, from age 11 until now, 44 years old, it's been an ongoing thing. It really never has let up.
It really doesn't. Once you start investigating it, it's one of those things that maybe you start off with one question or maybe two, and you're like, all right, well, okay, maybe I can believe some of the official story, but why did this happen or why did that happen? And that one question, by trying to answer that question, sometimes the question gets answered and it leads to 10 other questions, and sometimes it doesn't get answered and it still leads to 10 other questions. That's just the way the assassination is.
Oh, yeah. That's kind of all I do on the Dallas Action is ask questions. I'm not, it's like you said, regular blue collar kind of guy. I know I'm not smart enough to figure it out by myself, and probably never will. But you have to ask the questions. Douglas Horn, who I don't know if I'm sure a lot of your listeners are aware of who Doug Horn is. I got a chance to meet him at a conference last year and interview him on the show. He wrote the 5-volume Inside the Assassinations Record Review Board. He was the chief military records analyst. He's the man that discovered the Operation Northwoods papers, which I know you're aware of. He calls it applying the necessary intellectual vigor. And I've kind of adopted that from Mr. Horn and kind of made that my mantra. Ask the question. Within questions are questions. If there's an allegation that there was a meeting in New Orleans between a Cuban exile and this guy, we'll call him this guy. Well, learn all you can about this guy. Ask all the questions you can about these people. Learn their narrative. Ask all the questions about their personal narratives. That'll lead you to the question, would they be there? Would they know this person? would they have that association? And the more you look, I think it was Jim Mars that said that this is probably the one case in history where there's simply too much information. I think he nailed it. And that's probably the smartest thing I've ever heard the guy say. There is too much information. How much of it is disinformation? Well, ask the question, and you have to satisfy it. You have to satisfy your own personal gut. And it's hard to do. It's hard to do. Every question leads to more. I agree with you 100%.
And there's nothing wrong with that either. There's nothing wrong with just asking questions and trying to look at things and trying to get answers. And you're right, there's a ton of misinformation out there. See, with JFK, 9/11 is getting the same way. And so are many other topics. The agents, the COINTEL people, the shills, whatever you want to call them, whatever nickname you want to give them. Okay, the people that put out disinformation and misinformation, I call it shinfo. It's short for shitty information. Okay, the people that put out shinfo, they do it on purpose to muddy the waters, Doug. And I know you know that. I'm just saying that for the for the benefit of the listeners.
And we were discussing and to even give it much attention, I hate to, but one of those we were discussing off the air beforehand is the James Files story. That is a classic example of shinfo within the narrative, because once you look at the guy, once you break it down, once you study it long enough, you get to the point where you go, no, wait a minute, no, this is impossible. This is absolutely, it's impossible. So you have to be able to put that away. And I think that there's so much disinformation out there that we really have to learn to how am I trying to frame this? Once you become satisfied in your gut and in your mind that something is shinfo, as you put it, you have to be able to put it aside, put it away, and go, okay, I'm not going to consider this anymore because I know it's bullshit. But it still happens. It happens on a pretty regular basis, even with the JFK thing. I know for sure with the 9/11 thing. But the amount of shinfo that we have to wade through, especially when we study the narrative of the assassination of John Kennedy, is pretty overwhelming.
Oh, it is. Well, because they've had over 50 years to muddy the waters real well. And, one thing I want to say about shinfo before we get into a few things is this. A lot of people might think mistakenly that a new piece of evidence or something that comes to light might be shinfo. Something Doug may say tonight. Maybe Doug will say something that some of you researchers out there may have never heard before if you haven't heard his podcast, right? Like, I'm going to let him give his take on things too. So if you hear something new and it makes you struggle with an already held belief you have, don't do what we are programmed to do, because we're biological computers, our brains. Don't do what we've been programmed to do, which is automatically, and our ego also plays a part in this, where we automatically fight that information and we protect our belief. Allow yourself to at least look at the new evidence. I'm not saying believe anything or anyone. In fact, you shouldn't believe anything or anyone just because, just if Doug says something, just because he says it doesn't mean it's true. And just if I say something, it doesn't mean it's true. I urge you to always investigate things on your own. That's one of the reasons why Doug is where he's at, because he investigated things on his own. His 13-year-old son investigates things on his own. Okay? I mean, this is the way it works. You have to educate yourself. But don't shut your brain off if someone says something new to you. And I'm not saying you have to be super receptive and believe it, but at the same time, don't block it and automatically fight that. And because a lot of times we'll do that. Well, that's just disinfo, or that's bad. But why are you? If you jump to that conclusion without even doing any research, that's just as bad as putting out shinfo, because now you're just shooting down information and protecting your already tightly held beliefs, which you have to let the evidence take you where it may. You can't go into an investigation with an already pre-assumed decision on what you think happened and then try to sway all the evidence to fit that. That's not how it works. You're supposed to go into it and allow the actual evidence to take you where it may. So, and Doug, I think you would agree with that, right?
I agree with that 100%. I've told people before, and made the point on my podcast, the Dallas Action. You know, if I'm bold enough to stand up and put my foot down and say, matter of factly, I do not believe this to be true as it relates to the case. It's not, because a lot of times in our community, you know, if you say, let's say, for instance, we were talking about the BS James Files story. You know, if you tell somebody in a forum or you're discussing it with someone who does believe Files a story, their automatic reaction is to post up a YouTube link to, say, a James Files interview. Or they'll post up an article on James Files you don't believe him? Well, then you need to read this. If I'm bold enough to stand up and go, that's bullshit, I don't believe it, it's not because I'm uneducated on the subject. If I've got enough balls to stand up and say I don't believe it, it's because of what I have learned about that particular subject. It's not because I'm uneducated on it. It's because I have educated myself and it doesn't sit right in my gut. You know? You have to be willing to, especially in this case, you have to be willing to go out of your way to try to debunk something before you believe it. We have a tendency in this community, this research community, people who are interested in the case, to take any connection, no matter how threadbare it may be, to anything else, and treat it like it's 4-inch steel mooring cable. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. You know, I agree with you 100%. You have to look at it yourself. You have to study. You have to think. And, you know, I ran across some information a few months ago talking to an active duty United States Air Force intelligence lieutenant colonel that had to do with the RAND Corporation. And this is an example. The RAND Corporation, if you're familiar with the Robert Webster story, this is a guy that defected to the USSR about the same time Lee Oswald did. And the first thing I did was call Doug Horn. And the first thing he did when I presented this information to him was to stop and go, okay, now let's look at everything we know that contradicts what you think you've learned today talking to this lieutenant colonel. First, let's compare it to what we know. First, let's try to debunk it before we try to give it any legitimacy whatsoever. And you have to be able to do that, and too often people will not do that, especially when it comes to studying the narrative of JFK's assassination.
Most people just, they with any subject, they only dig a few inches deep anyway, Dougie. And unfortunately, that first few inches is usually where all the shinfo lies. You have to dig down past it, you know. You have to dig down past that first couple inches and get a little bit further into the subject, and that's usually where you start to find some interesting truth. So we have about 2 minutes left, and I want, since we're talking shinfo, because the break is going to come up really quick. We brought this up. We might as well discuss this really quick. James Files is this is the guy who supposedly was shooting from the storm drain, and he comes out and does these interviews where he says he's one of the assassins. I have never believed this story. I've always hoisted the BS flag on this story from day one. I've never done a show on the Kennedy assassination where I even mentioned it because I don't believe it. It's bullshit. So we got about a minute and a half left. Go ahead, tell me your thoughts, and the listeners, tell them your thoughts on why you agree and think that it's BS as well.
Because the people that murdered John Kennedy would not leave it in the hands of somebody like James Files and who he was at the time. He was a half-illiterate, 19-year-old, chop shop, Chicago mob carjacking goon. And the people that did this in the corridors of power of Washington, D.C., simply would not entrust a person like him at the time. And it's that simple. It's common sense. It's common sense. The people that murdered John Kennedy, that pulled the op off in Dealey Plaza, and hopefully we'll get into that some tonight, of who I think these guys were serious operators. And James Files simply was not. James Files is a guy that sat in prison, may have known Chuck Nicoletti, but I think he's a guy that sat in prison and read a whole lot of books, and somebody put him up to doing what he did. And by now, in the year 2015, in my opinion, he has been thoroughly debunked and discredited, and I cannot think of a serious student of the narrative anywhere in the world that I'm aware of that believes anything the guy says. Pure and simple.
Yeah, I don't believe anything he says either. Totally agreed, 150%. I think he was, obviously, like you said, he was put up to it. Probably knew enough, like you said, to put a somewhat convincing story, I guess, to some people out there. But I don't believe a single word of what this guy says at all. Period. End of story. Shinfo, 150%. We'll be right back. 3 short minutes. Do not go anywhere. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. So, we're going to get right into it. Word of warning. I want to just let everybody know, Doug and I do not see eye to eye on everything with the JFK assassination. When I say word of warning, I'm kind of being a little bit sarcastic, because him and I have like the coolest debates because we just conversate back and forth about this. But that's what's important to do in this research community, and any of them, because we shouldn't all agree on the same thing. We should be able to challenge each other a little bit. And Doug is even more skeptical of things than I am, which is good, because sometimes it's nice to have somebody that's 10 times as skeptical about certain things and is really a pain in the ass about it, because it makes you question things again too. Like, maybe he's got a point. That's the way it's supposed to work. A fresh set of eyes sometimes. And sometimes the other person might benefit from something you have to say. So anyway, Doug and I don't agree on everything 100%, but I also don't think that either him or I are 100% correct on everything, because, again, there's a lot of stuff that we don't know. There's still a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of stuff that we already do know, and you can piece together what happened. But there's still a lot of stuff that we don't know. And the sooner we all learn and understand that fact and accept that fact that we actually know less than we think we do, this whole learning process, the ego takes a step aside a little bit. You have to allow yourself to tell your ego, step aside and allow the learning to begin. Anyway, that being said, so Dougie, I want to get into the assassination in every aspect that we can tonight in the next hour and a half, but I figure we should start with, since we brought up James Files and we brought up the assassins, let's start with Dealey Plaza itself, because there's a lot of angles to come at the assassination in Dealey Plaza. And I know you wanted to get into the assassins themselves, how they were professionals. And since we were discussing Files and all that, why don't we start there? So I've got my own thoughts on it, but people didn't tune in tonight to hear me, pontificate all about it. I can add my thoughts about who I thought was there. But I want you to tell the listeners your thoughts on exactly what happened in Dealey Plaza, and pick up, with the assassins or wherever you want. But then, I know you wanted to get into the professionals themselves. So go ahead. The floor is yours, brother. I
tell you, I think there's a group of individuals, I think, and don't get me wrong, this is an important caveat. I'm not saying they're all guilty in the hit. But there's a group of individuals I call the Miami 7 They were anti-Castro operators. They were mercenaries. They were part Cuban exiles, a lot of them Anglos, Interpin-affiliated mercenaries. Interpin was a group of mercenaries that was started by a guy named Jerry Patrick Hemming in 61, pre-Bay of Pigs, down in Miami, and they used to pull the Cuban raids during the secret Cuban wars. And these guys were, like I say, Jerry Hemming, Frank Sturgis, whom that name ought to be familiar. He was arrested a few years later, breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate building. A guy named Felipe Vidal Santiago, who at one time, before he defected to the United States, was the chief of the Cuban Maritime Patrol, basically their little Navy, their little Coast Guard. A guy named Roy Hargraves, a guy named Billy Seymour, a guy named Lawrence Howard, and a guy named Loren Hall.
By the way, Sturgis?
I think
Sturgis is connected to Bobby Kennedy's assassination, too. Just throwing that out there for the listeners. Go ahead.
Yes, he is. I believe he is. Sturgis was embedded pretty deeply with these guys. As a matter of fact, Sturgis was informing on these guys to the Central Intelligence Agency when they were pulling their Cuban raids. They would. I call them the gunboat cowboys. And I think the truth of the Dealey Plaza hit team can be found within the associations, the motives, and the movements of these 7 guys. Roy Hargraves, he was known as the Mad Bomber. He is also connected to the Bobby Kennedy assassination. If you read Larry Hancock's awesome book, the first edition, Someone Would Have Talked, he published an interview that author Noel Slyman did with Roy Hargraves for his book, Bloody Treason, on the Kennedy assassination, which, to me, those 2 books are top 5 that anybody interested in the case needs to read. And he pretty much laid out how the op, in a roundabout way, how the op was pulled. And he admitted in the interview that he was in Dallas. He admitted in the interview that he was in Dallas with Felipe Vidal Santiago. And he admitted that they flew via private plane from Dallas to Miami after the assassination. Loren Hall, Lawrence Howard, those 2 guys, their connection to the assassination via a certain hot-rodded sniper rifle is, in my mind, probably the most overlooked and most blockbuster piece of information within the narrative of the assassination of John Kennedy. Would you like me to go into that story?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Loren Hall was, like I said, he was a mercenary. He found himself fighting with Castro, as a lot of these guys did. Most of these guys to overthrow the Batista regime, right? Excuse me. And they kind of stayed with Castro after Castro wins the revolution in Cuba. And then, of course, he comes out as a socialist, as a communist, and he starts rounding up subversives. Well, people like Hemming, Sturgis, and Loren Hall, who were working with Castro, start working against him. Pretty famously, Loren Hall, for example, along with Hemming, they were running guns to the anti-Castro rebels in the Escambray Mountains down there after he comes out as a communist. Well, Loren Hall gets rounded up, gets thrown in prison. He's got a friend who is a colonel in Castro's army that basically allows him to leave the country. Well, Hall comes back, and he starts organizing these Cuban raids, along with people like Hemming and Sturgis and Vidal Santiago. And these guys are hardcore. Let's make no mistake. These guys were rock and roll, full tilt boogie, drop of the hat, These were the dirty operators. When we talk about people like off the air a while ago, you and I were talking about St. John Hunt and E. Howard Hunt, Sturgis's running buddy in the Watergate thing. William Harvey, whom E. Howard Hunt named, in his confession, was the CIA guy over ZR Rifle. Well, ZR Rifle was the CIA's little operation to recruit and train assassins. William Harvey ran that. When ZR Rifle, or more famously Operation Mongoose, which I know you know what that was the CIA's anti-Castro secret Cuban war operation. When these guys had something that was so dirty and so bad that they needed ultimate deniability, they went to these guys.
They ran
like
that.
Hall.
They ran that through the University of Miami, by the way.
Oh yeah, yes. J.M. Wave, which was the CIA's station down there, was on the campus of the University of Miami. If I'm not mistaken, they had over 250 company cars. They had their own gas station at the CIA station down there, which was run by, in part by people like David Morales. I believe Tracy Barnes was the station chief there for a while for the CIA. But when these guys had something that was so bad, so dirty, that they needed the ultimate in off-the-books deniability, they went to people like Lauren Hall. They went to people like Gerald Hemming, like Felipe Vidal Santiago, like Roy Hargraves. These mercenaries, these anti-Castro militants who were running these raids. Well, let's fast forward to January of 1963. Lauren Hall, at this time, soldiering wasn't so much his wheelhouse. His wheelhouse was, turned out, public speaking, fundraising. What he would do is from California through Arizona, through Dallas, through New Orleans, to Florida. He went around the country collecting guns, ammunition, munitions, medical supplies, and money, and he raised all this through private ultra-right-wing people. In other words, he was a fundraiser. That was his wheelhouse. There are actually 33 1/3 vinyl records out there of speeches that this guy gave at John Birch Society rallies and meetings called Cuba Betrayed, Destiny Betrayed. I did an entire show on my podcast where I broke one of his speeches down. Well, in January of 63, he is in Los Angeles, California, with Gerald Patrick Hemming, who is as legendary a figure in the narrative of the assassination as anybody else you could think of. And they're short of money. They need $100 to help them get back to Miami. So they go to the office of a private investigator named Richard Hathcock. Now, what they did, Hemming says, look, we need $100. I have a set of golf clubs, and I have this rifle. Now, this rifle wasn't your ordinary rifle. This was a Johnson 30-06 semi-automatic, hot-rodded sniper rifle. Bipod, sound suppressor, scope. This was a badass rifle. They pawned it to Hathcock. Got their $100, got in the car, they went back to Miami. Okay. Now, some people put it, depending on who you ask, September-ish of 63, but most of the information we can come across seems to put it right there toward the end of September of 63. Some have said November, a couple of weeks before the assassination. Some have said later, earlier. But around then, right around the end of September, October 63, Lauren Hall and another one of these mercenaries by the name of Lawrence Howard show up at Richard Hathcock's door. Lauren Hall wants to get this rifle. He wants to redeem this rifle. get it out of pawn. So he writes a check. The interesting thing about this check was it was written on something, on the account of something called the Committee to Free Cuba. Right? Not the Fair Play for Cuba Committee like we think of Lee Harvey Oswald. The Committee to Free Cuba. The chief financial officer at the time of the Committee to Free Cuba was a man named Eladio Del Valle. Well, who's that? That's the only name David Ferry ever gave Jim Garrison. He was found dead in Miami the same day that Ferry was found dead in New Orleans later on during the Garrison event.
They overkilled that guy, dude. What they did to do that, they split his skull open with an axe. They eviscerated him. I think they cut things off. I think they was missing body part. They shot him. Oh, they shot him, stabbed him, and then I think split his head open with an axe. Like it was definitely they wanted him dead. He knew way too much.
He was stabbed 14 times, shot 7, and his head split open with a hatchet. The hatchet left in his head. Yes. Now, they redeemed this rifle, this Johnson 30-06 sniper rifle. Lawrence Howard, a guy named Celio Castro Alba, who was also one of these mercenaries, one of these anti-Castro operators. And Lawrence Howard and Warren Hall, they get Hemming's rifle. Gary Hemming's rifle. They take off back to Dallas with a trailer load of guns, right? This trailer was so overloaded with weapons and medical supplies that they're going back to Miami. They had to stop somewhere along the line in Death Valley at a junkyard and cut leaf springs out from under an old 54 Buick to weld up underneath it. They had everything from 20-millimeter cannons to morphine that they had gathered from wealthy John Birch Society ultra-hard right donors in California for the anti-Castro cause. Now, somewhere between Lauren Hall redeeming this rifle, this Johnson 30-06 rifle, and Florida, the rifle disappears until November 23rd, 1963, the day after the assassination. 21 hours after John Kennedy's killed, Richard Hathcock in Los Angeles, California, gets a knock on his door from FBI agent Jerome Crow. And we have this FBI report. Knocks on the door. Now, Hathcock wasn't there. There was a guy there that worked for him, another PI. His name was Roy Payne. He answers the door. Crow says, yeah, we need to talk to Roy Payne. Now remember, this is 21 hours after John Kennedy's assassination. Nobody's seen this rifle since September. Excuse me. And he says, I'm Roy Payne. What do you need to know? Sit down. Call Hathcock. So he sits down. He calls Hathcock. Hathcock comes down. They ask him 3 questions. Very pointed questions. Number 1, Roy Payne, were you in Dallas yesterday? Roy Payne says, no, I wasn't in Dallas yesterday. No, I was here. Number 2, when was the last time you saw Lauren Hall? A few weeks ago when he came by and picked up a rifle. Number 3, Roy Payne, why are your fingerprints all over a certain 30-06 rifle? Roy Payne handled that rifle a lot. He was a gun guy. In L.A. between January and late September, early October, when Hall picked this rifle up, he actually took it out and fired it. He broke it down just to see one day if it had been, before he fired it, if it had been converted to fully automatic, which it hadn't. But the point being is, if we study, if we apply the necessary intellectual vigor, as Doug Horn likes to say, and we look at this report, and we read, and we absorb the 3 questions that the FBI asked Roy Payne less than 24 hours after John Kennedy's killed, all the way over on the West Coast in L.A., they're knocking on the door. They want to know if he was in Dallas, When's the last time you saw Lauren Hall? Why are your fingerprints on this rifle? Now, in my mind, that tells me three things. Three very concrete things. Number one, they found this rifle. And they found this rifle in Dallas. Number two, they tied this rifle to Lauren Hall. And number three, not only did the FBI have this rifle, but they had fingerprinted this rifle. And in less than 24 hours had traced those fingerprints to Roy Payne, a man who had not been fingerprinted since 1947 when he joined the Navy. Now, that also tells me that rifle was used in the assassination of John Kennedy. Okay, Doug, where's your evidence that there was a 30-06? Is there any evidence, any possible evidence anywhere that there was a 30-06 used in the assassination of John Kennedy? Yes, there is. In 1979, a man on top of the Dallas County Records building was working on the roof. 1979. The county records building overlooks Dealey Plaza. It's kind of catty corner from the Texas School Book Depository. He's doing some repair work on the roof. It's on a weekend. He's got his son with him. Underneath what's known as flashing. I know you know what that is, right, Popeye?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Underneath the flashing, they find a rusted and pitted 30-06 shell, spent.
Must have rolled
That
underneath
tells
there.
me.
It must have rolled underneath there when a shooter was up there, and if they were policing all of their brass, he probably didn't see it. Although you'd think a good shooter would count, but you know what? In a situation like that where you're trying to, get out of there quick, and what kind of situation could you be in on the roof of that building where you had to get out of somewhere quick, and there were rifle shots? Oh, wait a minute. ... Go on, Doug.
Plaza. And the thing is, when we talk about, there's evidence to suggest that possibly Kennedy was hit twice in the head, once from behind, once in the back. And Dr. Walt Brown talks about it all the time. It's such a high angle shot that to have been hit from where Oswald allegedly was, that Kennedy would almost have to be bent over tying his shoes. Okay? The county records building, however, is a perfect match for that high angle shot. The point being is that less than, like I said, and the listeners can go look all this up. Go look up, if you type in Lauren Hall 30-06 nodule 13, in your Google machine, you'll get the entire story. It'll pop up. It's part of A.J. Weberman's work. The point being, not only do we have an old, pitted, used 30-06 shell found on top of the Dallas County Records building in Dealey Plaza, less than 24 hours after they hit. They're in L.A., and they're sweating Roy Payne about his fingerprints being on a rifle, a 30-06 rifle, that is tied to inner pin, that was hot-rodded specifically to lay down long-range, accurate cover fire at the Bay of Pigs. That's why it was as hot-rodded as it was. In 1960 money, that rifle was $1,100. Okay? We're not talking about no $12.95 Mannlicher Carcano mail-order piece of crap.
The humanitarian rifle. Call it by its perfect name, the humanitarian rifle, because you couldn't kill anybody with it. You couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with that rifle.
No, good Lord. And you know what, we could go, that would be something I'd love to get into with the ballistics of that rifle. I mean, there's so much in the official story, like they, the Warren report, well, he put it together with a dime. He had it broke down, and he didn't have a screwdriver, and he put it together with a dime. Right above my wall, hanging right here, I'm pointing at it. I have a rifle that is a Weatherby 300 Magnum. Okay? in today's money, it's worth more than the Johnson was in 1960. If I've got that thing sighted in at 1,000 yards, where I can, with the scope, I can put a hole in a dime at 1,000 yards. If I break that thing down and put it back together, what do I have to do, Popeye? I have to sight it in. You fire, you adjust. You fire, you adjust. You fire, you adjust. Because if you break a rifle down and put it back together again, it's not sighted in. It's not accurate. And that thing up there is not a humanitarian rifle by any stretch of the imagination, I promise.
I'm telling you, dude, if you tried to even shoot that rifle, look, I know some people don't like Ventura. We only got about 2 minutes, and some people don't like Ventura for many different reasons, but he proved he took a functioning Mannlicher Carcano and a guy who does have experience shooting and who knows how to handle a weapon. He couldn't pull it off. You know, Carlos Hathcock couldn't do it. And I'm going to tell you what, if that guy couldn't do the shooting that they say Oswald did, then Oswald didn't do the shooting. Okay. He didn't, you know, he was a non-qual on the rifle range. How could this guy pull something off that White Feather couldn't do? Impossible. I'm sorry, but that's
exactly right.
You know, it's not going to happen.
That's exactly right.
You know what I mean?
But you take a trained sniper with a weapon like that Johnson 30-06 with a bipod and a scope and a sound suppressor and put him on his belly on a roof, man, there you go. I am convinced that that rifle was used that day. Not only that, I'm convinced the FBI found it. Somebody found it. How else would they know less than 24 hours after Kennedy's killed that Roy Payne's fingerprints are on it? Unless they had possession of the rifle and unless they found it in Dallas.
By the way, I just got a message. Somebody asked me, who's Hathcock / White Feather? We have like a minute, but really quick. Carlos Hathcock is a Marine Corps legend, okay? This guy's one of the most famous snipers ever. As far as I know, he's got the record for the most kills still, single-handedly. It was up in the 90s by himself. This guy was absolutely a shooting legend. Just go look him up. Me talking about him for 30 seconds could not do the man justice with his abilities with a rifle. Anyway, he set up, when he was later teaching at Quantico, he set up a mock Dealey Plaza, and long story short, he could not do the shooting. So if he couldn't do the shooting, there's no way Oswald could have done it with the quote-unquote humanitarian rifle. I'm telling you. Even if Oswald was the best shot in the world, he couldn't do it with the rifle. Impossible. Stay tuned, 3 short minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for hour number 2 here on tonight's live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Popeye, from federaljack.com, popeyeradio.com, which is where you can find all of my audio archives of every show I've ever done and special broadcasts, anything I've ever done for free, high quality. And over on YouTube, DTRH Radio Archives, Delta Tango Romeo Hotel Radio Archives on YouTube. Anyway, hour number 2, breaking down the JFK assassination, my good friend Doug Campbell. And before we get back into the conversation about the rifles, and I just dropped the link in the chat room. If you want to go over to truthfrequencyradio.com, go over to the Listen Live link, and there's a link to go into the chat. You can either use your Facebook page, or if you have Twitter, use Twitter. You can log in. Chris set that up to have a level of security, and I'll tell you what, it ended any level of trolling. There wasn't really a lot going on, but any level of trolling, all of it stopped, because nobody wants to be associated with being a troll with their real Facebook account. When you can use Twitter, Twitter doesn't require you to have anything real either. So you can log in with either. So feel free, go over to truthfrequencyradio.com, go to the Listen Live page, click on the chat, log in, and you will see a link I just dropped in. It's going to an article that I wrote, which I'm going to bring up to Dougie and get his opinion on, because we're going to talk about the rifle and everything else. We're going to get into the magic bullet theory and a few other things. The title of the article is, "Were the rifles used in the assassination of JFK semi-automatic and not bolt action?" And I wrote this back in March of 2013. And you can, again, go over to truthfrequencyradio.com, go into the Listen Live section, click on the chat room, and then you'll see the link in there. Or just go to federaljack.com and type in, "Were the rifles used?" And then that should be enough to bring up the, in the search bar, and that should be enough to bring up the title. Anyway, before we get into all of this, I'm going to have Doug plug his show on Spreaker again, and when he's on and everything else, and where all of his archives are. So, Doug, before we get into the rifles and the magic bullet, go ahead, shamelessly plug yourself, my brother.
Excuse me, shamelessly plug myself. Well, my podcast is called The Dallas Action. It's on Spreaker.com, Spreaker. You can find us there. We're also recently picked up by the Tangent Bound Podcasting Network, the Wicked Radio Podcasting Network. And the easiest way to find the links to all my shows is to go over to the website that myself and my fellow podcaster and my brother-in-arms, Rob Clark, the host of the Lone Gunman podcast, started together. That website is 22novembernetwork.wordpress.com. Just 22novembernetwork.wordpress.com. And if you go over there, you can find all the links to all the shows, man. I think I'm up to 7 episodes now in the last 18 months, I believe. I'm going to upload 78. I usually also, you can follow me on The Dallas Action on Facebook. We're there, and the link usually goes up there first on Monday mornings. So there you go. I want to thank, and like I said before, Mark over at Tangent Bound and Devin over at Wicked Radio. I'd like to thank those guys again for picking up the show here in the last couple of months and adding us to their podcasting networks. That's awful nice of them. I was looking over your article here that you sent me during the break, and the M20, the M21, I believe, is one image you have up here. I'm going to send you, I was looking over that article, and I'm going to send you just an image, a photograph of this Johnson 30-06 rifle we were just talking about, and just let you look at this thing. And, it was a serious weapon, dude. It was a serious, serious weapon. And the one in the image I'm going to send you, like I said, it's not outfitted with, it had a Bushnell, 30 power variable scope, sound suppressor, and a bipod. The one that we were talking about earlier that was taken from Los Angeles and somewhere between Los Angeles and Miami disappeared until the 23rd of November. But I'll send you an image of that. You can see that. Also, you said someone sent you a thing asking about Hathcock, and we had both actually mentioned 2 different people named Hathcock. It was just it's kind of confusing. You were talking about Carlos Hathcock, the sniper, the legendary sniper, correct?
Yes, that's who I was referring to.
Yeah, and this is the guy that tried but failed to replicate Oswald's alleged shooting feat at Quantico. Well, the guy I was talking about was Richard Hathcock. This guy was just a cat in Los Angeles in the early 60s who ran a detective agency that these mercenaries knew. And they were, Hemming and Hall were they didn't have any cash. They needed to get back to Miami. So they pawned this rifle to Hathcock. He was just simply a guy they knew in L.A. Other than having the distinction of having possessed this rifle and pretty much held it in hock for Hemming until Hall went behind Jerry Hemming's back, without Hemming's knowledge, and redeemed it. As far as I'm aware, he doesn't have any other significant ties to the case, other than just, like I say, having the distinction of, having this office or this rifle in his office where Roy Payne, kind of had the opportunity to get his fingerprints all over it, which, again, is how it pops back up in the narrative, where 21 hours later, after Kennedy's killed, the FBI's in L.A., wanted to know all about it. So, I thought we would clear that up real quick before we got going.
No.
But I'm going to send you this image of Johnson. It just went your way.
Go ahead, drop it to me.
So,
Yeah, I'm glad that we cleared that up, because I know we wanted to straighten it out. We discussed that during the break. So let's get into the rifles. Now, I was talking to you, and I said to you, what do you think? My personal opinion as a shooter myself, if I was going to do this, and at the time they had the technology that was dependable, and not just something brandy new that they hadn't tested yet, but something that was dependable, which they did, meaning a semi-automatic sniper rifle as opposed to a rifle, a simple just bolt-action rifle. They did, back in 1963, have rifles set up, semi-automatic rifles set up as sniper rifles. And that's why I wrote that article. Now, I'm not saying it's definitively, yes, they used them, but the thought should be taken into consideration, because two of the shots came right on top of one another, and you could have that from two shooters. And there were obviously more than one shooter. I believe there was at least three shooters, or three teams, we could say, because you'd have one shooter, one spotter. And I believe there was somebody there in the overwatch position, which there's many different people that could say who was doing what, but that would be a side issue. The point is, if I was a shooter and I had the ability to have my hands on a reliable semi-automatic platform, and I could use that thing, and obviously all these shooters were using these rifles, whatever they were going to use, they were practicing with them beforehand, or something like it, so that they could get used to it. That's how it works, and it has to be sighted in. So these guys would have been practicing somewhere. There had to have been a dummy range. There had to have been something set up that looked like Dealey Plaza somewhere where they were practicing beforehand. There's no way that they pulled those shots off without practicing. I don't care who they are. They would have wanted to put a couple practice rounds first. They would have wanted to sight their rifles in. That's how a professional would have done things. Now, if I was shooting, I would have wanted to use, as I said, if there could be found a reliable semi-automatic platform that I was comfortable with and I had practiced with, and that was my job, then yeah, if I was the operator, that's what I would use over a bolt action, especially on a target that high priority and something that had to be done in just a few short seconds. He could not be allowed to live. The whole point of the assassination was Kennedy could not be allowed to leave Dealey Plaza. That's why they rerouted him into the bowl. If you've ever been to Dealey Plaza, it goes on a steep downward angle. It's a kill box. They put him in that kill box because Kennedy could not be allowed to leave Dallas alive. If they shot at him and he got away, no bueno. So he had to go. That means that they had to have professionals that were so good that they knew that they could rely on them, which means they were practicing somewhere. And again, if I were one of these professionals, I would want a semi-automatic platform over a bolt action. Dougie, your thoughts?
Well, I tell you that I'm a guitar player, and I'll use that analogy. If I'm going to a gig, a high priority gig, or any gig, a Fender Telecaster, for those familiar, is an exceptional guitar. It's a great guitar. But I'm a Gibson Les Paul guy. I'm comfortable with it in my hand. It feels right. It sounds right. Now, if I've got a choice of taking one of my custom shop Les Pauls or a comparable Les Paul versus just showing up at a gig and somebody goes, here, use this Tele. We've already got you a guitar. I'm not going to have the confidence going into that gig or going into that performance with just any guitar that somebody's going to hand me. You know, if I had my choice, I'm going to have one that I'm comfortable with and I know that's going to do the job. You're exactly right. And in a situation like Dealey Plaza, of course, we know about Roger Craig and the 7.65 Mauser bolt action that I believe was found on the 6th floor, along with maybe the Mannlicher Carcano. But I do agree with you 100%. A professional shooter is going to want the best weapon possible in any situation. He's going to want the best weapon possible. I do believe these guys were the real deal, the operators, these Miami 7 I talked about, the ones who I think were in the plaza, and some of whom I'm pretty convinced were part of the shooting team. And you're going to want to go into a job like that with a piece of equipment that you're comfortable with, that you know is going to do the job, and knowing you only have a window of a few seconds, I can't imagine going into it with a bolt-action rifle myself. I really can't. I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, maybe if there was a gunman, let's say there was a gunman on the grassy knoll, maybe if there was someone there, you could give him a bolt action. Maybe one of them would have a bolt. The more I thought about it when I wrote that article, I put myself in the shoes of the shooters, and I'm pretty sure that there was at least 3 shooting teams, and I picked out where I've done shows about where I think they were. I know you've heard my shows, and
oh yeah,
I decided to put my mind in the shooter's mind, like where if this was me and I was sitting there, and I was using a bolt action. How would I perform versus how would I perform if I was using a semi-auto? And I know.
Yeah, especially on a bipod.
Even, yeah. Well, no, you wouldn't have to hold it. You could just put it on a bipod and put the bipod on the window and allow the bipod to hold the weight of the barrel like any smart shooter would, especially because you'd be going after a moving target. You wouldn't want to use a sandbag or anything, which some guys use like a bag filled with sand. And you could do that depending if you're laying down in a window. I would guess these guys would sit. I mean, if I was doing it, you'd want to sit back a couple feet from the window and not stick the barrel out the window. Have the bipod sitting on like a desk or a couple maybe tables stacked up by one another, and you sit behind them, and then you just sit there and you look out the scope, and you have a limited window of opportunity to hit your target. You already know this. You've trained for this, Dougie. You know what I mean? Like, these guys were professionals. That's what they did. They weren't going to bring in, like you said when we were talking about files. They're not going to bring in some slack ass, thug that, or wannabe thug that could or could not possibly get the job done when they have professionals that could put a round up a flea's ass at 300 yards. That's the way it works. They would go with the professionals, right?
They would go with people like Lawrence Howard. He's the I'm not going to say that again, it's based on what I've studied. Lawrence Howard would be the guy. When you ask, he's the one guy that never talked until the day he died, and he's the one guy that everybody from Gerald Hemming to Lauren Hall to whomever you asked that knew him said, that's the best marksman I ever saw. Out of all, the whole milieu of this CIA's Cuban War, secret Cuban War, the anti-Castro operations, all of these operators, he's got the reputation as being the coolest and best rifleman / sniper of them all. Are you familiar with the name L.J. Delsa?
No.
L.J. Delsa was a former New York and New Orleans homicide detective that was hired by the House Select Committee on Assassinations as an investigator. Early on, before Blakey took over, before it turned into a fiasco, when Sprague was still running the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And I heard an interview that Jim Fetzer did with L.J. Dessa a couple of years ago. And they asked L.J. Dessa, it started with Sturgis, with the story about, I think the guy's name was Goldstein, who arrested Sturgis in New York City when he was allegedly harassing Marita Lorenz, which that goes down a whole another rabbit hole there. And according to this guy Goldstein, he said, "Nice shooting, Frank." And Frank Sturgis, according to this guy, confessed to him privately that he was the guy that pulled off the headshot, the Kennedy headshot. And Delsa stopped Fetzer really quick. He goes, no. He said, I met the guy. I met the guy that pulled the headshot off. He goes, what are you talking about? He goes, Lawrence Howard. They actually, him and his partner, got a hold of Howard, went to California in the late 70s and interviewed Howard. And Lawrence Howard, like I say, he was with Lauren Hall when they picked this gun up. He was another Interpen-affiliated mercenary, this gun of Hemmings that they went and got behind his back. Well, Delta says that Howard comes down out of the hills, right? They're outside L.A., Sacramento or somewhere. I can't exactly remember where he lived, but first thing he asks him, he says, are you carrying? Delta says, no. And he goes, well, I am. He had a 45 on his hip, he had a 45 in his truck. He said, but I'm going to put this one over here with this one. You guys come on up to the house. So Delsa, this career homicide investigator, and his partner, they go to Lawrence Howard's house and they sit with him for 2 hours. And he would talk about, he would talk freely about everything he was doing, who he was running with in the secret Cuban War, up until June of 63. And he would shut up, he would clam up, he would never speak another word. Then, February, March of 64, he would talk to them. He would answer their questions. And like I say, he actually invited him to the house. And, you and I we've talked about this a lot amongst, just ourselves, about gut feeling, about, when you read something, we were talking about files earlier, and you study something, and your gut just tells you, no, this isn't right. Well, Delsa said he walks out of, and Joan Mellon, I know you know who Joan Mellon is. Of course, she wrote A Farewell to Justice, which maybe is probably the definitive book on the Garrison investigation. And a lot of your listeners will be familiar with Miss Mellon. She puts a lot of stock in Delsa. And L.J. Delsa says that he came out of Lawrence Howard's house, and he looked across the hood of the car to his partner, and he said, that's the guy. And his partner said, what do you mean? He goes, that's the guy that blew Kennedy's head off. That's the man right there. And again, he's part of this bunch of operators, these mercenaries, private soldiers, these low down and dirty guys that the CIA would use for these dirty operations. And I have to believe him. I mean, when a guy with that kind of knowledge, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but apparently he had some outrageous clearance record, percentage-wise on cases he investigated, both as a New York City cop and as a New Orleans cop, as a homicide detective before he ever got with the HSCA. For his gut to tell him that after meeting Lawrence Howard the one time, and Lawrence Howard was known as the ultimate professional when it came to that kind of thing. And, it's like you say, if you've only got a window of just a couple of seconds, a few seconds, to fire, operate the bolt, re-engage target, fire again, versus fire, re-engage, fire again. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer. I have to agree with you 100%.
And I honestly, again, in my personal opinion, as a shooter myself, I would rather have If I had the ability to have, like I said, a stable platform and a good scope, I would use it. Oh, and by the way, speaking of good scopes, the so-called Oswald rifle, that piece of garbage, the Mannlicher Carcano, yeah, when the FBI tested it, I think it was the FBI who tested it, and when they did it, they had to sight the rifle in before they could hit a target with it and test it. So let me rewind for a second. Doug, you and I brought up a point earlier about what are you going to do with a rifle when you get it before you go target shooting. You're going to try to sight it in. Well, why did the FBI have to sight the rifle in again if it was supposedly used right before that to assassinate the president? Riddle me this, riddle me that, Batman.
They had to install what are known as shims under the front mount of the scope in order to sight it in. In other words, it's like using washers to make up the difference when you're trying to bolt something together. They had to shim it up to get it to the point where they could even sight it in. And you're going to tell me this guy pulled off the shooting feat of the century with this piece of crap? No. I'll never believe it.
No, you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. And somebody in the chat has been over on the live chat, Truth Frequency, has been chatting with me, and Mike in the chat, and he says we've been going back and forth about whether it was a semi-auto or bolt action. And he brings up a rather interesting point. He said using a semi-auto for the JFK hit, where the shooters used multiple shots, would have raised too much suspicion, in my humble opinion. And that's actually a very valid point. You only might have needed one team to have a semi-auto. Perhaps nobody had one. I'm not saying that it's definitively yes. I'm saying if I was a shooter and I had the ability to have something like that and I was comfortable with it and I had practice with it, then yeah, I would use it. I don't know whether or not, and it's part of the minutia that we may never really know whether or not they used semi-auto or bolt action, but it's just something I wrote an article about, something I had pondered and thought about, and when I thought about it, put myself in the shoes, and then I thought about the amount of shots that actually went off in Dealey Plaza. It is actually a large possibility that semi-automatic rifles were used. But Mike,
what listener's name that was in the chat room?
Go ahead, Dougie.
Oh, I was saying, what was the listener's name?
His name was Mike. I just wanted to say good comment and good thought. People are thinking outside the box.
That, Mike's absolutely right. That's a very valid point. And if we have, say, 3 snipers, and you want to pin it on one guy, if you've got 2 guys with bolt action and 1 guy with a semi-auto, maybe these 2 guys, maybe that's part of the operational plan. You guys get 1 shot each. This guy,
the
guy on the roof with the 30-06.
You have the guy with the guy with either the best shot or the guy with the worst shot. You decide, what works out better in your practice range, and you give that person the semi-auto. It all depends on the conditions and everything else. And like I said, they would have practiced it. Great comment, great thought in the chat room. Thank you, Mike. Everybody, I want you to go to the chat if you want to and participate. That's how we can interact. Doug, just hold that thought right there because the break's sneaking up on us. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 short minutes. We will be right back. Wow, the show's almost over. Don't go anywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Final segment. Wow. This show just went by mad fast. I'm going to have Doug back on to do multiple broadcasts because there's so much to talk about and so many different things we can get into, and we're just not going to have time tonight. Like him and I were talking about completely different things off air. That's why I prefaced the conversation originally with Doug and I don't always agree on everything, which is actually good because him and I bounce things off one another and we get each other to think. And that's what good conversation is about. And here I am talking with him tonight, and everything's like, yeah, Doug, do you agree? Do you disagree? And Doug's like, no, I agree, Popeye. So I thought that was kind of funny, Doug. I was thinking about that off air during the break. So
cool thing the cool thing is that we agree to disagree on some things, and we're adult enough. And I think there are a lot of people in this community, and I'm going to go ahead and say it, that could probably learn a lesson from this. Is that there are big issues within the discussion, study, and debate of the narrative of the assassination of John Kennedy that you and I do not agree on. But what we're able to do is recognize that and move on and still have positive, fruitful discussion on the subject. We're adult enough to put those differences aside.
We actually
Dr. Walt Brown.
We have conversations about that stuff too, by the way. It's not like we ignore it. And we actually, we talk and I'll say to you, okay, what don't you like about this? And you'll ask me the same thing. Well, what don't you like or what don't you believe? And when I say I don't, I use it in the term of almost like a detective would. Like, what do you, when they use the term or, it's not whether or not it's like a personal feeling. It's more so who do they think is involved in something, like who do you like for the murder? So, that's what I mean.
Exactly.
And that's what, Doug would mean too. And we bounce things off each other too. And there's nothing wrong with that. You and I have had some very intriguing, interesting off-air conversations. That's why I wanted to bring them on air. But it's funny because I prefaced, our conversation that you and I might not agree, but a lot of the stuff tonight we actually have agreed upon. But there will be future shows. So just so the listeners know, where Doug comes back on, and we're going to get into other things like, was Johnson involved, Ed Lansdale and Dealey Plaza or not, things like that. And I want to have these debates with Doug because he's an adult and he has a differing opinion on a few things than I do. And we need that. We actually need to have this differing opinion discussion because it's actually going on in the research community, but we have to have it in an adult manner. So we will be having other shows, just so the listeners know. Doug will be back on very soon, I promise. Now, that being said, Doug, I know that you wanted to get into the magic bullet and the magic bullet theory, which this goes back to the rifle.
It's not so much. There's information out there. The magic bullet debate. You got people like Vince Bugliosi, the late Vince Bugliosi, who wrote what was the name of that big giant piece of shinfo he wrote? I can't even remember now. Gerald Posner, he wrote Case Closed. Where they claim to have proved it. And if anybody's familiar with, and anybody familiar with the JFK case is absolutely familiar with the magic bullet theory, the single bullet theory. Commission, they call it Commission Exhibit 399. The perfect, pristine, unmarred, unscarred, unflattened projectile allegedly fired from Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle that caused 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wounds, I guess, is it, in 2 different people. And it's the familiar, the scene in Oliver Stone's JFK where the bullet would have had to pause in midair and turn and do this and do that. And you've got people from both sides using algebra, geometry, trigonometry, alchemy, whatever they can use to prove or disprove the case. Well, what people don't understand is it's been disproven, and it's been disproven in the official record. Okay? We can put on your show, Popeye, Down the Rabbit Hole, we're tonight on this final segment, we're going to put the entire single bullet theory or magic bullet theory debate to rest. Are you ready?
Tear it up, Dougie.
Okay. In 1977, the House Select Committee on Assassinations heard testimony under oath from an FBI ballistics expert by the name of Yates. Yates was the man charged with test firing this 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano alleged murder weapon, the Heidel Oswald rifle. He was the man charged with test firing this weapon. Okay? So he goes up and he swears his oath and he sits down. This is again, I know I'm repeating myself. This is the man the FBI sent to Capitol Hill to testify for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The man that put the bullets under the microscope. The first thing they ask him, they ask Yates, did you test fire the weapon? Yes, we did. Did you compare the bullets from your test firing session, to the bullets that the FBI fired when they test fired the weapon for the Warren Commission in 1963, or early 64? Yes. Were they a match? Yes. The bullets that Yates, in fact, test fired from the alleged murder weapon, matched the bullets that were fired by the FBI in 1964 for the Warren Commission. Now, they asked him about Commission Exhibit 399, which is this alleged magic bullet. And this is what Yates told them under oath. This is what he tells them under oath. There were significant differences in the lands and grooves of Commission Exhibit 399, the lands and grooves on the original set of test bullets fired by the Warren Commission, and the test bullets that we fired for the House Select Committee. Now, what are lands and grooves? When a bullet is fired, a bullet spins as it's traversing down a rifle barrel. Does it not? Yes, it does. What this does is it cuts grooves into the bullet into a pattern that is specific to a rifle barrel. The grooves are obviously the grooves. The flat planes between the grooves are what is known, but that's what we call the lands. So what this man told them under oath on Capitol Hill, and it's in black and white in the official record, the House Select Committee on Assassinations report, there were significant differences between the lands and grooves of Commission Exhibit 399, the Warren Commission test bullets, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations test bullets. They go further. They ask him, were you able to confirm that this bullet was fired by this rifle? And he says under oath, no, we were unable, to the exclusion of all other rifles, conclude that this bullet ever traveled down this barrel. So what does that tell us? I'll tell you what that tells us. It doesn't matter what kind of math you come up with. It doesn't matter how many different ways you line Connolly and Kennedy up. It doesn't matter if you use trigonometry, if you go to Hogwarts and get Harry Potter to use his magic wand. It doesn't matter a hill of beans what sort of acrobatics or magic you think this bullet was or was not capable of once it left the rifle barrel. Because the FBI told us under oath that they can't prove that bullet was ever in that rifle barrel to begin with. So we just put it all to rest, didn't we?
So if the bullet that was supposedly found didn't match the rifle, and then the shooter couldn't have done the shooting, I mean, there you go. There's official story turned into a pile of garbage and thrown out. And I know there's much more to rip apart, and I'm not saying this.
It's right there in the official record.
Well,
the FBI guy going,
there's other
basically
minutia.
saying, don't look to me to tell you that bullet was ever in that barrel, because I'm not going to do it.
Well, there's other minutia that we could get into, but if you want to if you really want to destroy the official argument, you can pick. I always tell people, if you want to end the argument with someone who buys the official story, or if you want to debunk it, instead of taking it on from 7 or 8 different angles, just pick one that you can totally destroy the official argument, and just debunk it. And if you can debunk the magic bullet theory, because that's part of their whole case, that it was a lone gunman, right? And that was made up by Arlen Specter. So,
right, and the whole reason it came up was because of James Tate. They had one shot that they had to account for. They had an extra bullet.
Yeah, that's
James Tate, the bystander.
James Tate.
Yeah, so Specter just invents it out of whole cloth.
But
this
that's why
magic bullet theory.
That's why you can destroy that whole theory, though. If you can, and it's with anything. If you can take the whole argument, what I'm saying is, if you could take on the argument of the official story of the assassination, and you can pinpoint something like that, and it's not just that. There's a ton of other stuff too. But if you can just pinpoint one thing like that and prove it, there it is, done. It's officially done. And this is a big deal, because again, if the gun didn't do the shooting, it's one thing if the shooter can't do the shooting, Doug. But if the gun didn't do the shooting, then how could it have been done the way they say it was? You know what I mean? It's impossible. And I want you to.
Here's the big thing about.
I want you to rewind.
Here's the big thing about.
I want you to do me a favor and rewind for a second. Can you tell the listener one more time where that information can be found?
That information is in the testimony of the House Select Committee on Assassinations investigation in 1977. Guy's name was Yates. He was the FBI's ballistics expert that they sent to Capitol Hill to testify. And the man tells them, under oath, we cannot conclusively, concretely tie this bullet to that rifle to the exclusion of all other rifles. What's important about that, not only does it blow the single bullet theory out of the water, but had Lee Harvey Oswald lived to make it to trial, guys and gals, that right there is the very epitome of reasonable doubt. Right there. The bullet doesn't match. The magic bullet, not only does it not match the FBI bullets test fired in 1977, it doesn't match the bullets fired in 1963 for the Warren Commission either. And if that's not reasonable doubt, I don't know what is.
Well, all you got to do, again, is look at any piece of this story like that. And if you can find, and you know what I'm talking about, you can find something to totally destroy the argument. And factually, like where you can go, here you go. I'll bet most people don't even know that in the 70s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations found that there was a conspiracy to not only kill Jack, but also Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. And that was back in the 70s. And then there was a civil trial that was like 99 or 2000. I think it was 99. Maybe it was even a little earlier than 99. It was like the late 90s. Let's say like 99. Martin Luther King Jr.'s family was involved in, and they found in that trial that the government was responsible for his death. So, this stuff does happen. This isn't theory. This is actual fact. Not only
that, but they forwarded, I'm sorry, Popeye, but they forwarded a recommendation to the United States Department of Justice to reopen all 3 cases with an emphasis on the John Kennedy assassination. And as far as we know, that recommendation is still on somebody's desk, not acted upon. To this day, people don't know that in 1996, at a civil trial, that the United States government was found guilty of complicity in the murder of Martin Luther King Jr.
His family,
98% of Americans are completely unaware of that.
his family went to the funeral of the supposed assassin, ladies and gentlemen. Think about that for a second. I want you to let that sink in for a second. That would be like Jackie Kennedy bringing John to the funeral of Lee Harvey Oswald, if he was the actual assassin, if you're to believe the official story, right? And that it's just some lone gunman. That's the equivalent of that. What? That does it.
Well, you know, you and I were talking about earlier Lauren Hall, Lawrence Howard, Jerry Hemming, these interpin-affiliated mercenaries. There is, and maybe we'll get into this in a future show, there is ample evidence that one of these guys who ran in the same circles, along with Bernardo de Torres, who was the Carlos in Gaten Fonzie's awesome book, The Last Investigation, this guy, Robert Emmett Johnson, was Raul, the guy that handled James Earl Ray. Same bunch of guys. If you go to Larry Hancock's book, someone would have talked, and I mentioned it earlier, the interview that one of these guys gave to Noel Twyman for his book Bloody Treason on the Kennedy assassination, there's actually a passage in there where he slips, Roy Hargraves slips, this mercenary, and he tells Noel Twyman, you know, 3 of us from the JFK thing, Fat Larry, Jerry Hemming, and myself were on the ground in L.A. during the Kennedy assassination. See, at that point in Los Angeles, Lawrence Howard, who was a big Mexican guy, had infiltrated the Brown Berets. Hargraves, there is evidence to suggest, was Umbrella Man in Dealey Plaza that day, and that he was also known as the Mad Bomber. He was part of, and I know you're aware of this, something called Operation Chaos that the CIA ran through the LAPD in the late 60s. Basically what they would do, they would blow up a Brown Beret, which was kind of the Hispanic Black Panthers. Hargraves would set a bomb off, firebomb one of their offices, firebomb some of their people, blow a car up, blame it on the Black Panthers, cause chaos within the dissident, what Hoover considered the dissident community. Same bunch of guys, same bunch of operators, from the Kennedy assassination through Robert Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, all the way up through Watergate, from Hargraves to Howard, like I said, all the way up through Watergate to Sturgis.
And Morales
same
and Sturgis.
Bunch of,
yeah, and they're
Morales and Sturgis.
And you know,
well, a lot of people don't know.
About Sturgis.
Believe me, out Santiago.
One thing, Doug, you talked about Sturgis earlier. By the way, you said you were talking about the shooters. A lot of people people say that Sturgis was pretty long in the tooth by that time, and that he wasn't the shot that he used to be, and that they doubt that he would have been one of the shooters that day, especially in such a high profile, high anxiety driven, high energy moment. I have to question whether or not maybe they, if he was getting up there like that and he wasn't at the top of his game anymore.
Well, that's what I mean when I say with this bunch of guys, the Miami 7, that I'm not going to say they're all guilty. I'm 100% convinced of the guilt of Santiago and Hargraves in the hit, in the actual operation that day. But I think that's what I mean when I say within that the truth of the hit team can be found within the motivations and associations and movements of these 7 guys, like Sturgis. You know, was he in on the hit? Was he a facilitator before the hit? You know, did he help move some things into position? Maybe. Was he an actual shooter? Probably not. You know, if my feet were held to the fire tonight and I had to make a call one way or another, was Sturgis a shooter? I'd say no. No. I agree with you there. I don't see him as a shooter. I see him as a possible facilitator.
I see him as what Hunt called himself. You know, when Hunt called himself a bench warmer, and I said this to St. John when I had him on, and I was sitting, you know, and I've thought about this a lot. Hunt talked in code. All these guys did. That was their whole thing. They're trained to do that, so they're never going to break that. I get it. So they talked in code. I think Sturgis would have been more like what Hunt, when Hunt said he was a bench warmer, I don't think he was referring to I didn't have anything to be involved in it. I think bench warmer means like overseer, like as in if he wasn't on the bench, then he would have been one of the hitman. But since he wasn't there, since he was overseeing things, he was speaking in spy speak. That's how they speak. They have their own little different lingo. Okay. So I think there was like a double meaning to what he was saying. And Sturgis, I think, would have been the same position. That by that point, he would have been so high up that you don't have him doing that stuff anymore. Okay, you have him running the show because he's that guy. You don't have him boots on the ground. That's what you got other guys for. You know, who, you know, in 10 or 15 years would, if things kept at that same pace, would then be in Sturgis's position, you know, with the government or with the company. And they, you know, who knows what they would have, you know, accomplished. Of course, let's just be honest. And this is why I don't think that James Files, again, this is another way to shoot some disinfo down. If anybody, any of the shooters claims to be still alive, I doubt they are. I doubt any of those guys, unless they used a professional that they flew in and then flew out, which is a possibility, which Doug and I will get into in future shows because we have only a few minutes left. But I honestly think that if they were any local people, and that's why after the assassination so many people ended up dead, I'm willing to bet, just like in the movie Shooter, when Mark Wahlberg runs into the old man and he says to the old man's talking to him and he's talking about the Kennedy assassination and he says, oh, you know, within 48 hours those guys were, you know, dead and buried out in the desert. And he goes, yeah, how do you know, old man? He says, because I still have the shovel. So I'm willing to bet that if there were, you know, unless again they brought in somebody from like, and Prouty talked about how there was, you know, they had an island where they had professionals where they just trained, they were professional killers. And if they brought 1 or 2 people in from there, they might not have killed them. They might have sent them back to there, or they might have just got rid of them because you know how this cabal is, Doug, and you know how it works. They don't care about anybody. But definitely I would say at least half, if not more, of the shooter teams were disposed of within 72 hours. What say you?
I think I don't know, Papa. I don't know. I go back to what Delsa said when he cut Jim Fetzer off real quick when Fetzer said, well, Sturgis was a shooter. And he goes, no. He said Sturgis was a blowhard. He goes, this guy Lawrence Howard, he was a closed mouth and he didn't say nothing about nothing. When he went into why he thought Howard was the guy and his gut feeling, a lot of it had to do with the fact that Howard wouldn't talk. And, you know, Howard never did. Lawrence Howard is the one guy that never granted an interview and never said a word. And if I had to, like I say, you know, we talk about, I do believe Santiago was the quote-unquote dark-complected man, radio man. I do think Hargraves was probably Umbrella Man. I think that Lauren Hall took Jerry Hemming's rifle to Dallas to use in the hit. But the only person in all of my studies that I'm willing to put my finger on as a probable shooter at this point would be Lawrence Howard, and a lot of it has to do with his reputation as a tight-lipped guy.
Dougie, I got to cut us off.
Yeah,
I got to cut us off there because the literally the end of the show is here. Don't go anywhere. You know the drill. I'll call. I'm gonna say goodbye to you on air now, but I will call you back in a second. So, with that, ladies and gentlemen, go check Doug out. Okay, I promise you, you will not be disappointed with his broadcast. He's over on Spreaker. Again, he will be back within the next, let's say, 2-3 weeks. So you won't have to wait too long. I love you all. We'll catch you all again live next week. We're out.